He didn't use a knife first. He used a pencil. He'd sit across from you in a crowded bar, capture your likeness with haunting precision, and hand you the sketch. In 1976, a man sat in a room just like this one. He was a household name, a world-class entertainer whose face was recognized across the country. Across from him, the San Francisco police were offering him a choice. They had a suspect in the next room. They had the sketches. They had the blood-stained history. All they needed was for this man to point his finger and say, "That's him. That's the man who tried to kill me." The man looked at the sketch. He looked at the detectives. And then he did the unthinkable. He stood up, walked out of the room, and refused to ever speak of it again. He wasn't protecting a friend. He was protecting himself. In 1976, being outed in a court of law meant your career was over. Your family was gone. Your life, as you knew it, would end. The killer knew this. He didn't just carry a knife. He carried the weight of a billion-dollar secret. He knew that even if he failed to kill you, the law would finish the job for him. This is the story of the Doodler, a man who sat in the shadows of the most vibrant bars in the world, capturing the beauty of his victims on paper before dragging them into the darkness of the Pacific dunes. He was a ghost created by a wall of silence. He targeted at least 14 men, leaving 5 dead and several others scarred for life. Police had his name. They had his face. They even had his DNA on a discarded cigarette. Yet, today, he is a free man. Or a peaceful ghost. Because, in a city that was supposed to be a sanctuary, the cost of justice was simply too high to pay. He thought his victims would rather die, or let others die, than be known. And for 50 years, history has proven him right. We aren't just looking for a killer tonight. We are looking at the moment a society's prejudice became a serial killer's greatest weapon. It was January 27th, 1974. Gerald Earl Kavanaugh was 49 years old. To the people who knew him, he was the quiet one. A shoe salesman who had left the cold winters of Canada for the promise of the West Coast. He was a man of habit. He worked, he walked, and he searched for a connection in a world that told him he shouldn't exist. That night, Gerald was at the truck stop on the Great Highway. It was a diner, a late-night refuge for the community. The lights were low. The smell of grease and coffee filled the air. He didn't approach Gerald with a threat. He approached him with art. He sat near him, watched the way the light hit Gerald's face, and began to draw. Witnesses later recalled this young man, black, about 5'10", slender, and seemingly shy. He handed the paper to Gerald. A portrait. A gift. It was the perfect icebreaker. It was a way to say, "I see you. You're beautiful." In a time when men like Gerald were taught to be invisible, this was an intoxicating kind of attention. They walked out of the diner together. They headed toward the dunes, away from the prying eyes of the streetlights. Gerald thought he was walking toward a moment of intimacy. He had no way of knowing that the man with the sketchbook had already finished his work. The next morning, Gerald was found. He was lying face up in the sand, fully clothed. And the attack had been a frenzy, over 20 stab wounds. The overkill suggested a deep personal rage. But as the detectives turned his body over, they found something the killer hadn't taken. The Doodler had left his calling card. He hadn't just killed Gerald, he had captured him first. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a ritual. And as the police began to look closer at the accidental deaths and random muggings in the area, they realized that Gerald wasn't the first. He was just the first one they couldn't ignore. 5 months later, the ritual repeated. Joseph J. Stevens was 27 years old and a rising star in the San Francisco club scene. He was a female impersonator, a man who lived for the spotlight. On June 24, 1974, he was seen at a club, talking to a man who was sketching him. The next day, Joseph's body was found by a bush in Golden Gate Park. Like Gerald, he had been stabbed repeatedly. No robbery, no motive, just the signature overkill. The city began to whisper. The Doodler was no longer a rumor. He was a predator. But as the fear grew, so did the mystery. Why were there no witnesses? In a city of thousands, how was a man sitting in crowded bars, drawing his victims, and then murdering them without a single person remembering his name? The answer lay in the very secret the Doodler was using as a shield. To the rest of the country in 1974, San Francisco was a city of chaos, a place of protest and upheaval. But to a young man growing up in a small town in the Midwest, or a stifling suburb in the South, San Francisco was the New Jerusalem. Maud, it was the only place on the map where you didn't have to check over your shoulder before you spoke. It was a place where you could finally stop pretending. Every day, Greyhound buses pulled into the Transbay terminal carrying 20 and 21-year-olds who had nothing but a suitcase and a desperate need to be seen. They arrived with dreams of becoming artists, performers, or simply finding a job where they wouldn't be fired for who they loved. They were looking for a family they chose, rather than the one that had rejected them. They thought they had finally reached the finish line of their struggle. They thought they were safe. Joseph J. Stevens was one of those dreamers. He was 27, but he had the energy of someone who had just begun to live. In the clubs, he was a star. He was a female impersonator who didn't just perform, and he transformed. He spent hours on his costumes, meticulously sewing sequins and adjusting wigs, preparing for the moment the spotlight hit him at the gilded cage. But offstage, Joseph was known as a gentle soul. He was the kind of person who would listen to your problems for hours over a drink. He was a man who believed in the inherent goodness of the people he met in this new sanctuary. He had spent his whole life hiding. Now that he was in the light, he wanted to share it with everyone. Think about your own life for a second. Think about that feeling of finally reaching a goal, of finally feeling comfortable in your own skin. You start to let your guard down. You stop looking for the exits. You start to trust the stranger who sits next to you and offers a kind word. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? Not with a glance, but with a gaze that felt heavy? Maybe you felt a chill in a warm room, or noticed someone following your movements from across a crowded floor. Most of us dismiss it. We tell ourselves we're being dramatic. We call it paranoia, and we push it away so we can enjoy the night. But what if that instinct was the only thing standing between you and the end of your story? This was the Doodler's greatest trick. He didn't look like a threat. He didn't look like the monsters people saw in the movies. He was described as a quiet, attractive young man. He had a way of making his targets feel like they were the most interesting person in the room. He would find a seat in the corner, usually at places like the Pointer or the truck stop. He would wait until he found someone who looked a little lonely, or someone who was riding the high of a good night. And then he would begin to draw. For Joseph Stevens, the encounter likely felt like just another night in the city of dreams. A talented young artist wants to capture your likeness? It's a tribute. It's a moment of connection in a world that used to ignore you. Joseph was last seen leaving a club in the early morning hours of June 25, 1974. He wasn't alone. He was with the man who had been sketching him. He walked out into the cool San Francisco night, likely talking about art, or the show he had just finished, or the future he was building. They didn't go to an apartment. They went to the park, a place that felt like a Garden of Eden during the day, but became a labyrinth of shadows after dark. Joseph thought he was with a friend. He thought he was in the safest city in the world for a man like him. He had survived the judgment of the world only to walk directly into the path of a man who saw his life as nothing more than a rough draft to be erased. When Joseph's body was found by a gardener the next morning near Spreckles Lake, the police were forced to acknowledge a terrifying reality. This was the second man in 6 months found in a public space, murdered with a savage intensity that went beyond a simple crime. The detectives began to talk. They looked back at Gerald Kavanaugh's file from January. Then they looked at the reports of random assaults that had been dismissed as bar fights. A terrifying thread began to pull all these stories together. It wasn't just the murders. It was the sketchbook. In every case, witnesses mentioned a man drawing. In some cases, the sketches were found near the bodies. The killer wasn't trying to hide his presence. He was using his art as a mask. The sanctuary was broken. The men of the Castro began to look at each other differently. Every time a stranger sat down next to them and pulled out a piece of paper, the air in the room changed. The dream of San Francisco was beginning to turn into a nightmare, and the police were about to realize that the man they were hunting was much closer than they ever imagined. By July 1974, the city was no longer dealing with a series of tragic accidents. They were dealing with a predator who was refining his craft. Klaus Christmann, a 31-year-old man, became the next face in the Doodler's gallery. Klaus was different from the others. He was a father. He was a husband. He had a family waiting for him. But, on the night of July 7th, he stepped into the shadows of a bar called the Gilded Cage. Klaus was found the next morning by a dog walker at Land's End. The brutality had reached a new peak. The medical examiner noted that his throat had been slashed with such force that it suggested an explosion of sheer, unadulterated hatred. In his pocket, police found a small, folded piece of paper. It was a sketch. It wasn't finished. It was as if the artist had been interrupted, or perhaps as if he had seen enough. The investigation was a mess of contradictions. The police were searching for a black man, approximately 20 years old, slender, who carried himself with a quiet, artistic air. But in 1974, the police's relationship with the gay community was one of deep-seated mutual distrust. Every time a detective walked into a bar to ask questions, here the music stopped and the room went cold. The very people who were being hunted felt like they were being interrogated by a secondary enemy. This disconnect created a vacuum. While the police waited for a respectable witness to come forward, the Doodler was free to continue his work. He was no longer just a man in a bar. He was a ghost who could appear and disappear at will, leaving behind nothing but a portrait of a dead man. In late 1974, the SFPD thought they had their man. They received a tip about a young man who had been seen at several of the bars where the victims were last spotted. He was an art student. He was known to carry a sketchbook. He was black. He matched the physical profile to a staggering degree. The city held its breath. The detectives spent 36 hours in an interrogation room with him, and they showed him the photos of Gerald Kavanaugh. They showed him the blood-soaked sand of Ocean Beach. They waited for the crack in his composure, the slip of the tongue that would end the nightmare. But the art student had an alibi. A solid, unbreakable alibi for the night Klaus Christmann was murdered. He wasn't a killer. He was just a young man who happened to fit a description in a city that was looking for a scapegoat. When they let him go, the realization hit the department like a physical blow. They were back at zero. The red herring hadn't just wasted their time. It had given the real Doodler a window of opportunity. It allowed him to see how the police worked. It allowed him to realize that if he was careful, if he stayed in the gray areas of the law, he was essentially invisible. On May 12, 1975, Frederick Kappen's body was discovered. He was a 32-year-old nurse and a Vietnam veteran. He had survived the horrors of war only to be caught in the Doodler's trap. His death followed the same ritual: the sketch, the walk to the beach, the frantic violence. The investigators were now dealing with a pattern that was so consistent, it was terrifying. The Doodler wasn't changing his tactics because he didn't have to. He was winning. Every investigation has a moment where the path forward is either taken or lost forever. For the Doodler case, that moment came in January 1976. The police finally had 3 survivors. These were men who had been attacked, stabbed, and left for dead, but had somehow managed to crawl back to life. One was a diplomat. One was a famous entertainer. One was a person of significant social standing. They were the key. See, their testimony would have been the weight that tipped the scales. The detectives brought the suspect in, the real suspect this time, a man who had been caught with a sketchbook and a knife. They put him in a lineup. They brought the survivors in behind the two-way glass. One by one, the survivors looked at him. They recognized the eyes. They recognized the way he held his shoulders. They knew with absolute certainty that this was the man who had tried to end their lives. But when the time came to sign the statement, to agree to stand in a courtroom and identify him, they all said the same thing: "I can't." This was the point of no return. In 1976, to testify against the Doodler was to admit you were at those bars. It was to admit you were gay. At that time, that admission was a death sentence for a career, a social life, and a family reputation. The survivors were caught in a horrific trap. Protect the man who tried to kill you, or destroy the life you had worked so hard to build. They chose silence. And in that moment of silence, the Doodler case went cold. Not because of a lack of evidence, but because the price of justice was higher than the survivors could afford to pay. The suspect walked out of the station, picked up his sketchbook, and walked back into the San Francisco night. He was never charged, and he has never been caught. For decades, the Doodler case didn't just go cold. It became a ghost story. The sketchbooks were filed away in the basement of the Hall of Justice, gathering the fine gray dust of the passing years. The detectives who worked the case retired, taking their frustrations with them. And the bars where the victims were last seen closed down, replaced by high-rise condos and tech offices. The wall of silence that had protected the killer seemed to have become permanent. But in the world of cold cases, time is a double-edged sword. While it erases memories and takes the lives of witnesses, it also brings forth technologies that the original investigators couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. In 2018, the SFPD did something they hadn't done in over 40 years. They pulled the Doodler files back into the light. They weren't just looking at the sketches anymore. They were looking at the microscopic. They had cigarette butts recovered from the dunes of Ocean Beach. They had DNA samples that had been preserved, frozen in time, waiting for the science to catch up to the crime. In 2022, the investigation took a shocking turn. The San Francisco Police Department announced that they didn't just have a profile, they had a person of interest. He isn't a ghost. He is a man in his late 70s, living a quiet, unremarkable life in a California suburb. Imagine it. A man who might have been the most prolific serial killer of the 1970s, now an old man, perhaps sitting on his porch, watching the sunset, or shopping at the local grocery store. He has lived an entire lifetime, 5 decades of freedom, while his victims' families were left with nothing but unanswered questions and a faded sketch. But here is the tragedy of the Doodler case, one that hasn't changed since 1976. Knowing who someone is and proving it in a court of law are two very different things. The DNA found on those cigarette butts is trace DNA. It's old, it's degraded, and it might not be enough for a definitive match. The original survivors, the men who looked him in the eye, they are mostly gone now. Their silence from 50 years ago has become a literal silence today. Without a living witness to point a finger, or a smoking gun DNA profile, the police are caught in a legal stalemate. They are watching a man they believe to be a monster, waiting for him to make a mistake that he hasn't made in half a century. The Doodler case remains the ultimate what if. What if those survivors had felt safe enough to testify? What if the police had prioritized these lives with the same intensity they gave to other high-profile cases? The $150,000 reward for information still stands. It is one of the highest rewards in the city's history. But the money remains unclaimed. The archives remain open. And the Doodler, the artist who drew his way into the lives of his victims, continues to be the most successful ghost in American criminal history. He used the era's prejudice as a shield, and that shield has held for 50 years. But as long as these files are open, as long as people still remember the names of Gerald, Joseph, Klaus, and Frederick, the wall of silence has a crack in it. The question is, will that crack ever be wide enough to let the light of justice in before the clock finally runs out on a killer?